I think I'll start. I've just put us to record. I think we have Tareen, we have Michael and Jamar. How are you guys doing?
Good, how are you?
Okay, great. So today's session, you would have covered earlier this week with with Mr. James. You would have covered, some of the legal aspects, human rights, etc. So what we're going to do for this session is to cover data management and the different aspects of. I see we have one other person who have joined us. Welcome. The different aspects of data management and how you can go about protecting the data, the kind of considerations as a CSO that you will have for your organization when it comes to how you collect your data, how you access data, how you share data. All of that is going to be important for when you come to, not only in terms of general management of the organization, but certainly when it comes to developing an advocacy campaign. So I'll start by trying to get a feel from you, just how have you been dealing with data in the organization so far? If you can just give a couple of examples. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, Linda, I can hear you. Can you ask again?
Yes, my question was how are you currently dealing with data in the organization? Data, information, that kind of stuff that you gather to use to help in decision making. Or, if you have a plan, if you don't, you can say that as well. I just want to have a sense of what you guys are currently doing in your different organizations.
Right now, for me, I guess I can speak on behalf of myself and the Caribbean Young Democrat Union. I am right now functioning as the treasurer of that organization. Oh, crap.
Okay, anyone else? Jamar, do you have any idea?
Well, generally speaking, this is an area that we need to work on, but in terms of financial reporting and so on, when we have our general meetings and our, annual general meetings, we tend to be able to present reports. But in terms of doing the necessary research for projects, this is something that we need to work on in terms of gathering data before we, formulate a plan of action. So data gathering is something that I'm definitely key on learning about.
Hello.
Yes.
So for us, we do outreach to the community. So we have forms that are physical forms that we fill out and we have filled out, and then they're returned to the office. They're then inputted into an Excel sheet and combined that way. And then what we do with the physical sheets is we store them away safely in a filing cabinet, and we have backup files of the digital copies online and on our external hard drives, etc. And so the way that the Excel sheet is set out, you can pull data that you might need, that we might need going forward for project proposals or reports or whatever the case may be.
Okay. All right. So as I said, what we're going to cover today is that we're going to just have a sense of why data management is important. I'll share my PowerPoint screen with you, so just give me a chance while I try to see. Okay, so we're going to go through why data management is important. We look at some of the means that you can use to protect the data that you generate. And that's going to be very, very important in terms of having a little bit more, having control over the data or the information, data and information that you have in the organization. How do you go about sharing that data? Just some of the considerations. And then, just the key elements of a data management plan. What we will expect is that I'll post a worksheet up either later tonight or tomorrow, where you can start working on. It's only going to be expected to be like between 1 to 2 pages, where you start to look at your organizational data management plan. And a component of that is we're going to have you taking a look at how you are going to be managing data specific to the advocacy strategy or plan that you're going to be developing and presenting at the end of the training sessions. So in terms of the terminology, I think we need to be a little bit clear as to what we're talking about when we speak about data, information, and knowledge. Because very often those are concepts that get kind of used interchangeably. So, somebody might say, well, we're collecting data, when in actual fact they might mean that they've got information that they can share as opposed to raw data sets, etc. So just so that we get a sense of we're more or less on the same page, we'll just go through just quickly what those different terms apply to. So when it comes to data, what we're talking about is unorganized, unprocessed facts. So I can't remember who it was, but when you mentioned that you have the forms and you collect information and you put them onto a spreadsheet, chances are that's raw data that you are collecting and storing. And then when you take that data and you do some analysis on it, you transform that data, then that's when you start to generate information. Okay? So in terms of protection and how you use and terms and conditions, it's going to be slightly different depending on what it is you're actually starting with. So anything that is static in nature, in terms of discrete sets of information, numbers, figures, images, etc., then that's basic data. Data is not information. It only becomes information when somehow it's being, as I said, manipulated, analyzed, put in a report, etc. And also, data is not knowledge. When it comes to information, when we talk about information, then we're talking about, as I said, processed data. So anything that when you use that information, so for example, if you have basic data on, if you conducted a survey and you have basic information that would say, for example, so you ran a workshop. This is a very simple example. You ran a workshop and you have collected information on the participants. So you're likely to have the participant's name, the participant's address, and maybe some other pieces of information about the participants. Now that in itself, you can put in a spreadsheet. That will be considered raw data. But when you start to extract that information in terms of how many participants, then you start to disaggregate that information, disaggregate that data. So you know that you had 50% of the participants were females, and the ages and stuff. That when you start to use that information then to put into your reports and for decision making, then that is what we're talking about in terms of information. Okay. So data that is transformed becomes information in how it's being processed. Knowledge is a little bit more elusive in that, in terms of its definition, it is what you know, but then again, how do you determine exactly what you know? But it does build on data and information. All right. So here is a definition that we have, pretty long, but it shows you how it's almost a bit intangible, but still it has, we talk about institutional knowledge, and that institutional knowledge comprises not only your data sets that you have and the information that you have, but the analysis that it have. It also includes the experiences of the organization. So how you actually then start to manage that knowledge that the organization has, to bring that to bear, especially when it comes to advocacy. When we get to developing the advocacy strategy in those modules, you'll see that one of the key things for an organization is the reputation the organization has plays a key role as well in how effective it is with regards to advocacy. And that institutional knowledge, that knowledge that you have that is based on information, is based on data analysis, reports that you have, credibility, the kind of information you have to back up your strengthen your advocacy campaign is going to be very, very critical. So here, and this is just for your perusal when I post the slides up, this just gives you like a whole set of different types of definitions that you can have for knowledge. So you can just look those up, but you can see how it varies by, in terms of the definitions are quite wide and quite varied. So my question really is, why is all of this important to a CSO? And this is my question that I have for you, so I can start to engage you. And first, I should probably ask, what are your opinion on the definition so far? Can I get anyone?
Well, I always thought that data and information were synonymous.
Okay.
So, it's given me some insight that data is just a set of raw figures, etc. But then when it's used to inform decision making, it becomes information. So that was definitely new for me, and definitely kind of made me bring data and information into a new perspective.
Okay, anyone else? I mean, you also don't need to agree with the definitions. You can say, well, I have a slightly different opinion on what it means, and that then we can just go back and forth in terms of discussion. But if you're okay with what I've presented so far, then my question is, why is it important for CSO? In terms of when I speak of the knowledge assets, I'm speaking again, as I said, knowledge comprises the data, the information, the experiences the organization has in terms of manipulating that data, presenting the information, and being able to influence decision making, not only internally, but externally as well. So why is that important to or for CSOs? I'm giving you a little bit of time to think about it.
It's so they can better understand what impact they want to have or need to have in the area that they're working. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear. Yeah.
Okay, great. So like analyzing the data to gain knowledge. I mean, also you can use it in monitoring and evaluation so that you can better adjust perhaps any projects that you're doing as well, where you can see where you have gaps and try and fill the gaps if possible. So yes, that's part of why I think it's important.
Well, definitely. I like the fact that you mentioned the monitoring and evaluation. It's very often that data that you collect the reports that that you prepare are all good. When you're doing monitoring and evaluation, and you have your objectives, you have your indicators, and you have your means of verification, then those become important when it comes to being able to show success and having implemented that particular, successfully implemented that particular action, and the overall, the specific objective, and to some extent, well, not to some extent, and definitely the overall objective. So that is correct. What then are some of the knowledge assets that a CSO is likely to have? So we established at least a few examples of why it's important, but then what are some of those assets? If you kind of think back to the definitions of data information, all wrapped up in terms of the knowledge assets. Think of your own organization. What are some of those assets that you have? Not meaning to pick on anyone specifically, but Kendron, I haven't heard from you yet.
My signal is a bit poor right now, so I'm trying to get into Wi-Fi zone.
Mm-hmm.
But what was the question again, Wendy?
I was asking, think in terms of your organization, what would be some of the knowledge assets that your organization would have?
Okay, well, one of the knowledge asset that we would have is we're in the process now of having a HOPE program. The issue we are having though is that not a lot of youth has access to this information.
Mm-hmm.
So we're actually testing various platforms, communication platforms, like social media. We're trying the newspaper, like the Daily Star, which is a type of newspaper in Jamaica.
Okay, but those sound as if it's more or less external to your organization specifically.
Wendy, if I may just add,
Mm-hmm.
if I could back up to why is knowledge so important to CSOs, I would say that knowledge is important because without knowledge, there is no system or there is no organization. It would not exist, in my opinion. And as for assets, could our members, our people be one?
Yes.
Well, there we go.
In terms of how you, because we're talking data management. So if you have your members and a list of members is a database, whether or not that list is just written or whether you have it in a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, or whether you have it in a very sophisticated, easily searchable database, etc., it's still a database. So you're right, that would be one of the assets that you have in the organization.
Okay, well, I think my organization just created a buddy system. And with that buddy system, we have organized where we now have persons, contact information properly stored on spreadsheet files where it's easily retrieved. So that's how we manage that aspect of data, at least.
Okay, very good. So then we're talking about raw data sets. So again, if you're collecting specific pieces of data in terms of age, in terms of other stats, that would be considered your raw data sets. You have your database, so what you just mentioned. Information containing your documents and reports, those would be considered part of your knowledge assets. You have your policies, procedures, even your contracts that you have. And then, as I mentioned before, when it comes to expertise and experience, that all kind of rounds up. And these are just examples. You know, the list is much longer, but I think these are some of the more obvious examples that we'll encounter, especially if you're project-based. Then that's the kind of information that are likely to make up your whole set of knowledge assets. Okay, my other question now is, how would you then acquire this kind of knowledge, or these knowledge assets? If you pick any of them, your databases, or just raw statistics that you would gather, how do you go about actually acquiring that knowledge?
Sometimes we do surveys.
You could also do focus groups.
Yes. So all of those actually generate the kind of information that you, the kind of data that would be relevant to your organization. I'm trying to advance the slides, but it's not moving. Oh, there we go. So in addition to that, those are very obvious. That's how you collect your primary data or your primary pieces of information. But then you get information from your contributors. You get you know, data or information from employees and volunteers, your members. Also, with respect to your grants, your administrative records. I think somebody mentioned their financial and administrative records. And certainly from your research and development, which will also can include the surveys, et cetera, that you conduct. And then to tie this into when you're developing your advocacy campaign, one of the things that you'll need to do is to identify who your stakeholders are, and to do that stakeholder mapping. And some ways of doing that would be, you know, in terms of research and development, conducting your surveys, focus group meetings, etc. That is how you then you begin to gather the relevant data that can be applied to support the claims that you're making when you're doing your advocacy strategy, when you're developing that strategy and bringing out that campaign and engaging with stakeholders. So it is important, though, to note that when it comes to data, and right now I'll stick to the word data, being a very primary basis of information, because we are going to go forward in terms of looking at data management. But the source of that knowledge asset, whether it is the database, the data sets, reports, etc., will have an impact on how you can use that data. So one of the things about CSOs is that you have to have access to information, you generate information, and you also share that information. So how you actually access, or rather the source of that information, is going to have implications for how you can do that. Okay, and we're gonna start to cover that as we go through. Feel free to stop me at any point in time to clarify something, to make your own contribution. I'm quite okay with that. So as I mentioned before, the significance to CSOs is that you require access to information in order for you to begin to build your case in terms of advocacy, or even for you to determine, one of the first worksheet you had to go through, what are your priorities, what's the priority issue? And then we're going to expect you to build out a specific priority issue, come up with a solution, but then you need information, you need data to back that. So where do you actually access that information, and how you access that information is going to be very, very critical. The form in which you ask for that information may determine your access. So, for example, you may require information from a particular agency, and they may not They may not give you access to the primary data, but they may give you access to a report that they generated based on that primary data. Now, that in quite a lot of cases, that is fine. But if you really, really wanted to do the analysis yourself, you want to have access to that primary data. Okay, so the form in which you require your information may have implications for access. Then you also generate, you will generate data and information, you will store that, and how you actually do that will again have implications based on your contributors that we mentioned earlier, whether you're getting your information from a grant, for example. Sorry, your information was generated under grant conditions, and then the contract might specifically spell out what who owns anything that is generated, data, reports, etc., that's generated from that particular project under that contract. And so
Wendy,
that
I have a question.
that will have an implication as to what you can do. Was that a question?
Yes, I wanted to know. So when this data is not easily available, where do you go from there? Do you abandon that priority issue and perhaps go to another issue where data is forthcoming?
Where data is more readily available? It depends. It depends on the capacity of the organization, because the data may not be available in where you consider it to be most obvious. So you figure this particular government agency should have this information or should have this data. But then, it might either be a case where, 2 months down the road, you still don't have access to it because nobody has gotten back to you, or they may not be willing to share the information. But then you should have, in terms of research, look for other sources of that information. So you should not really, when I say information data, you should not really just have one source in mind. But if it becomes extremely difficult in terms of getting getting the data, getting the information that you need to back and support your advocacy campaign, remember that you can tackle an issue, a problem, from different angles. So, as you said, you may abandon that particular angle, but there may still be an angle that you can take within the organization where the information is more easily available. But I would say that you really do need to be extremely creative in how you get information and how you get data. Okay, from my own experience as a consultant, I find that very often, especially when it comes to environmental data, some of the obvious organizations, obvious entities, when you request information from them, you either have to wait a very long time, or they don't have it in the form of which, in the form that you want it, which is quite interesting, because a lot of work is being done by a whole set of agencies: public sector, private sector, the CSO sector. Generates so much information, but it is just not readily available. So you do need to try to find every single angle for which you can get information. But also, I think it's an internal decision in the organization to determine when do you stop, relook, because again, when it comes to advocacy and coming up with your advocacy issues, solutions, and moving forward, it's an iterative process. So you examine, and you may have to abandon, go back to the drawing board until you come up with an issue that you can move forward with. Anybody else wants to, from your own experience, respond to that question? Okay, so So I mentioned that as a CSO, you will also generate your own information, and you have to make a decision on how that information is going to be, how that data, how the information is going to be used, by whom, and under what conditions. Also, you tend to, you will also have to share. You may want to share that information. So what you generate, you can use internally, but you may also want to share it with your partners or other agencies. And you need to determine exactly, is it going to be fully open access, or how you will actually go about doing that. So now we focus on data and data management. And this is just, again, to recall what we're referring to when we speak in terms of data and data with regards to data management. So again, that unorganized, unprocessed facts, raw numbers, figures, etc. So when we talk about data management, we're actually talking about a series of steps that seek to ensure that information is, that you have information in the form of which you want it. So either in terms of raw data sets or analyzed reports, but whatever it is, it has to fit within your, when I say your, in terms of the organization's mandate and business strategy. Okay, so it's important then for us to start to understand what are some of those legal considerations then that will facilitate that seamless exchange and the use of data. Because always remember, what you want to be able to do is access, generate, and possibly share, not possibly, and share the data that you do have on hand. So some of those legal considerations, we think in terms of ownership. We think in terms of protecting that the information. So things like how do you protect that data that is produced by the organization? In terms of ownership, who actually owns the data? How is that ownership determined? And then what do you do in terms of you collaborating with another entity and there's joint ownership in terms of the data sets or the information that's being presented. We're also looking at the terms of data exchange. So are there any, data management agreements in terms of data use and data sharing? Then we're also looking at the quality of the data obtained and that is being stored and also retrieved. So depending on the area that you are working in, you may find that there may be specific standards in relation to data collection, data storage, data use. So for an example, I recently worked on a project and they were looking at data management from an environmental perspective, and more specifically in terms of hydrometeorological data. And there were international standards that guided, how you collect that data, how you display the data, and how you report the data. And that really is so that, at least at some minimum level, information can be shared across computers. So, to make that data and the information, well, more specifically the data, interoperable, so that different agencies can collect that information, share it, and be part of a network that is looking at anything from the impact of weather, climate change, etc. So those are the kind of things that you can be looking at. Important for us to note that all forms of knowledge or all forms of knowledge outputs are really a form of intellectual property. It's that those part of the knowledge assets I spoke about before. If you want, it could be your intangible assets. And they can be protected through various forms. So for example, by copyright, trademarks, trade secrets, to some extent, patents. We're going to go through all of these. Specific database rights, as well as paying attention to your licensing agreements and your contractual arrangements. they will all really have an impact on how you can actually, how you use the data, how you collect the data, how you use the data, and how you have also control of the data that you generate. So let's start with copyright. So when we're dealing with copyright, and we're not going into the details of copyright, this is just to give you an idea of what is being protected under copyright. So when we're talking about copyright, we're really referring to literary and artistic works. So we're talking about books, drawings, paintings, musical works, etc. But in some jurisdictions, and we need to be careful here, not all countries allow for the protection under copyright for databases. Okay, so in some jurisdictions, copyright protection can also extend to things like computer programs, maps and imagery, and databases as well. So from your perspective, again, thinking about your organization, what kinds of copyright material may your CSO, may your organization actually have that you think is that can be of considerable value to the organization? Hello, anybody?
Are you asking what kind of copyright materials our CSO have?
Yes.
Right now we do have, would photos and videos be considered?
Yes, for sure, definitely. And how do you what to say? How do you I was going to say store, but how do you actually display those at this point in time? What do you do with them?
Right now we are taking part in a Let's Vote campaign, and from that perspective, we have been collecting our own pictures and videos, which we then use on social media.
Okay. How do you go about ensuring, how do you think at all in terms of ownership of those photographs, for example, because you put the photographs there, but you know, the organization actually owns the photographs. So what do you do in terms of ensuring that other people know that it is your photographs or the organization's photographs, and they can't just cut and paste or copy and use them as they see fit?
Right now, I don't think we have any copyright materials listed in any guidelines, but we normally put our logo, our abbreviation somewhere on the photo or somewhere on the video.
Okay, so that signals, at least to some extent, that this is a branded piece of material belonging to whoever owns the logo. Okay, yes. Anybody else? Okay, so just to again for you to wrap your mind about it, any literary or artistic works, so books, your reports, for example, any drawings that you might have, photographs that you might have, and a key example of where you would actually use your photographs would be on your website, on your social media presence, as well as any brochures, etc., that you do use. Okay, so this is just another example that, so with regards to copyright, you know, each country will have its own copyright law, and there may be slight differences and variations in those, in that pieces of legislation. So again, you need to be careful and not think that what applies in one jurisdiction applies in another jurisdiction. But when it comes to copyright, there is no need for you to register, make an application for registration for protection of copyright. It's automatically protected for those countries that are part of an international convention called the Berne Convention. Like I said, I'm not going to go into the detailed legal aspects of any of these, but just to try to drive home, the different forms in which you can look to protect your data. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property, there's an agreement that speaks to broadly intellectual property, but this particular article that I have here, Article 10, speaks to the protection of the compilation of data in terms of computer programs and other materials. So I mentioned patents as I decided to put patents on the list, but more or less to draw your attention to the fact that in some countries they allow for the protection of not only in terms of products, in terms of inventions, but also in terms of processes. So in some countries they allow for software, some software to be protected, as well as databases. But for the most part, under most countries would not allow that to happen. But I just thought I'd put it there so that you have an idea that it is possible, and it depends on the country that you're dealing with. So I'll leave that for thought, but I'll move on to, again, I mentioned contracts. So your contractual arrangements that you have may actually specify what can happen to the data that is being produced under a project, for example. And it might be very specific as well as to who owns any intellectual property, in this case, any data, reports, et cetera, that is generated as a result of you executing that particular project. So it's important to know that, because then that can also determine how free you are to use the data for another purpose, as well as share that information. Confidentiality. So again, some types of data, when you collect certain types of data, and again, it depends on the area that you're in, it may be considered private. Typical example would be if you are a CSO working in the healthcare sector, for example, HIV/AIDS or anything like that. The people that you're serving, if you want to call them your clients, you'll have a database of who they are. But that information is likely it might be because of a particular law, for example, where you cannot share that information as freely as you would like, because of some aspect of privacy, some aspect of confidentiality. Okay, so again, you would be able to use the raw data in terms of numbers. So, you can use X number of people. You can use maybe disaggregate that information in terms of males, females, age group, and etc. But personal information, you will not be able to share. And then there may be some, you may, for example, have access, you may have requested access to data or information, and that might have been provided to you under strict confidentiality. So again, how you use that information will be determined by that confidentiality. And then we have trade secrets. And really these are any confidential information that would give the owner of that information a particular competitive edge. So I'm trying to think of a specific scenario where trade secret would come into play. I think for CSOs, it's probably more a case of your contractual arrangements, your confidentiality, etc. I don't have it here, which is an oversight, but you did mention, someone just mentioned your logo. So your trademark as well would be quite important in terms of associating that trademark, the logo, catchphrase, whatever it is, in terms of your branding with the CSO and the information that you, just in terms of being able for, I mentioned earlier, the reputation of the CSO, in terms of credibility, trust, etc. All of that comes into play in building confidence in terms of when you're doing your advocacy campaign. All right. Are there any questions?
No questions from me.
Everything is quite clear?
Yes,
Yeah,
ma'am.
everything is clear to me.
Okay. So you're, I think when we first started and I asked a question, in terms of what kind of data or knowledge assets that you have and how you can protect those, are you beginning to see how a picture is that, are you beginning to see the picture clearer, I should say? Well, I hope you are, because the next section, we're going to be talking about developing your data management plan. So really what we're looking at here is having an overview of the type of the type of data or the type of assets that your organization is likely to have. Then based on your organizational, your business strategy, based on your mandate, for example, then you develop your data management plan specifically to support that. Okay? So what we start to talk about is, one, determining data ownership, and not only data ownership from an internal perspective in terms of what you generate, but also when you have access to data, I mean, you have access to information, understanding that that you have acquired from a third party external to your organization, that there may be some aspects of it that is controlled in terms of what you can and cannot do with that data. Not and quite a lot of cases, information data is transferred between organizations, between NGOs, between CSOs, and on a kind of informal kind of basis, because you really don't necessarily think that anything significant is likely to negatively impact your use of that information, or in terms of the data. But it's still always a very good idea to make sure that ownership is established, even if it's just in an email. It's a very simple email, that says that the information is being transferred and it's for the specific purpose for which it's been requested. That in itself starts to establish a concept of ownership, especially if you haven't taken any of the previous steps to look to protect the information that you've been generating. And internally, what it does is also so you have a very clear idea as to what you can and cannot do with the information that you have in hand that you may have acquired from someone else. So more often than not, then the ownership is claimed on the data sets, the data item itself, or any value added that you would attribute to those data sets. And why this is becoming all so important is that the use of data, raw data, the data sets, is actually, there's a growing sector where people are actually using that kind of information to develop services based on the data that is being generated. So a lot of apps, for example, are being developed based on what you call big data. So where people are mining the data and coming up with easy solutions for persons in terms of access to that data and how they can actually use that data. So that's why it's becoming a whole lot more important now to be able to to have some kind of management plan in place. So what are some of the things that you start to think about when it comes to data management? So first of all, you ask yourself, what data are you going to be collecting? How is it going to be processed? How is it going to be generated? Okay, are you going to be using surveys, focus group meetings? How is it going to be collected? And in what form is going to be collected? Things like methodology and standards, how, will they apply? How will they apply? Is there a national standard, an international standard with regards to collecting the type of information or data that you want, that you will be collecting? Obviously, how you plan to use this. If you're using it for decision making, if you're using it to back up your whole advocacy campaign, again, it's going to be critical how you collect that information. Okay, it's also important to know just having collected the information, so you executed a survey, just which parts of that information can you actually use, and just how much of it can you use. So can you use just the numbers, or can you use, say, geographical locations, names? Specific names are going to be a little bit dodgy in terms of privacy, but in some cases, even something as simple as a geographical location can be a bit ticklish as well, especially if you're dealing with in the healthcare sector. You probably want to also know, will data be shared, and under what terms? And if you don't currently have some kind of data sharing template, you may want to actually start looking for a very simple data sharing agreement that can go along with the information or data that you are likely to be sharing, or that is likely to be shared with you. Will the organization have an open access policy, and what factors will need to be considered? So you may find that you may want to hold your information close to your chest, but you may have had, a grant for executing the project, for example. And one of the conditions of that grant could be that, the information should be shared. Either, if you're in a network, so if there's, say, for example, there's a global body, and you're part of that, then they may say it should be shared within the whole network, or it should just be open because of that's the policy for which, the terms and conditions of the grant. So that's why your contractual arrangements are also very, very important. So how will the information also be curated and preserved? Someone mentioned earlier that when you have information, you have data on your clients, your target stakeholders, and you've collected that information. You collect the data. Most likely, you verify the information is accurate, correct, and you put it in the spreadsheet. Then you determine exactly how it's going to be stored, how it's going to be backed up. Just basically how it's going to be preserved, and then how it's likely to be retrieved and used. So how will that data be curated? So if you start to answer all these questions, then you actually begin to build your data management plan. What legislation or even contractual arrangements will govern how the data will be collected, how it will be used, and how it will be shared. What are the IP issues? Again, your contractual arrangement might specify specifically, but then internally, you can also determine, what IP issues are relevant to you. Are you going to be, copyright, like I said, is very simple. There's no need to register. But, are you going to develop a sophisticated database? Then if you do, and you do it internally, are you looking to see if you can protect that in some other jurisdiction, or you just leave it as it is? How much will, importantly, once you develop the plan, it has to be implemented. So simpler is always better, because then it means that your costs are not going to be that high. But it also means that when you are doing planning within the organization, then it is important to consider this, because that's going to be a cost. The cost is going to be associated with it. In terms of how you're going to store the data. Are you going to do it in the cloud? So then do you have an annual membership fee for which to access to the cloud, et cetera? Those are all things that you need to consider and factor into your when you're developing your strategy, especially when it comes to implementation. So I mentioned data sharing before. So when it comes to data sharing, there are a couple of things that you need to consider. One is the sharing justified? So when you're talking about sharing the data, what will be achieved by sharing that the information? What are the potential benefits? What are the potential risks associated with sharing it, and also for not sharing it? Because you have a choice. You have the information. You can decide you want to share it, or you can decide that you don't want to share it. And that is generally. Obviously, if you're collecting the data, then you're collecting it for a purpose. What is that purpose? And how can you use it beneficially to advance your cause? So very often then, this course is about advocacy. So how are you going to use that information in terms of developing your advocacy strategy for a particular issue? Okay. And again, consider things of confidentiality. Is there, is the data confidential? What objections might there be to sharing the data by the stakeholders for who you've collected that data from? That is probably more consideration when it comes to the raw data. But once you've analyzed that data, then you have a whole lot more freedom in how you use the information that's generated. Then a key question is, do you have the authority to change that, to share that data? Do you own the data? What about the organization that you work for? Is it guided by a larger overarching policy, by an umbrella organization? What kind of permissions that might be required to share the data? So this not only goes from an organizational perspective, but you as an individual may get a request by someone to share some data or information that you have, but do you have the authority to do that? What are the procedures in the organization that would allow for that? And then when it comes to actually sharing the data, what do you need to, as I mentioned before, the data sharing agreement is very, very important. It doesn't need to be elaborate, but could be 3 paragraphs that state clearly the information that's being shared and why it's being shared and what can be done with the data or information that's being shared. Yeah, and then of course you keep a record. You keep a record of that, all the information that is being shared, who it's been shared with, what type of information was shared, for how long are you're expected, the person who you're sharing the information with, how long they're expected to use the information. Is there a lifespan to that? What happens if they use that information, use the data that you present, and then process it in some way that could also be beneficial to your organization? How do you have access to that information? Yeah, so basically, again, if you have an agreement, then keep a record of that agreement on hand. So basically then, that covers what we wanted to present to you in terms of data management. I know it's an hour. It doesn't cover everything in depth. But what we're hoping for you to be able to do is to be able to develop a data management plan for your organization. It's it's an area that most organizations tend to overlook, yet it's extremely critical. As I said before, especially, for most organizations, CSOs within the region, we tend to access or funding for the work that we do from external organizations. And the terms of those contracts can determine exactly what we can do with our data. But also because it goes back to an earlier slide where, you want to have access to data to facilitate your decision making. You generate data to facilitate decision making, especially when you're putting your advocacy campaign together, so that you can influence persons so that you can effect change. So, are there at this point any specific questions in this particular area? As I said, the worksheet for this will be uploaded tomorrow for you, so you can actually start taking a look at what is expected. The PowerPoint presentation, as well with the notes included, will also be uploaded for you.
Remind me again of the uploaded spot. What is it? The Google Classroom?
Yeah, it will be in the Google Classroom. So once it's there, then it should automatically generate a notification to let you know that, I've shared this information with you, so you can go there and have access to it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Wendy.
Oh, sorry. Didn't mean to do that. Now, how do I get out of this? Yes. So any questions?
Nope, I think it's just time to get to work and manage our data a bit better.
How do you think you'll start to address your data or look at your data in the organization differently?
Well, we don't have any agreements drafted at all, so I think we would have to start from the foundation and come up with an agreement on how we even share the information,
Mm-hmm.
and then find ways to claim it or own it as well to secure that spot.
Okay, but remember that for the most part, remember that the data management, it has to have a purpose. So, and it has to be it has to be tied to what the organization's business strategy is, or what your mandate is. And so that would also determine exactly what you do. I mean, you can do nothing, but just how, I think the question is just how much information do you actually share? I know a lot of work is done under a project. You collect the information relevant to that project. You write your reports. The reports are submitted. But then what else? What happens when that project is done and all that data and all that information is there? What do you do? What do you do with it?
Repeat it again, Wendy.
I was asking with all the data and information that the organization has collected, your CSOs in general have collected, what do you do with it apart from the obvious, which is initially completing the project, writing the reports, doing the evaluations relevant to the reports, and then what else? What do you do? What else do you do with that data that might be collected on your project?
For us, when we do collect data, we usually sit among ourselves and discuss best practices, and then each person usually goes back to their home country and then try to implement whatever strategies they have learned there on the ground.
Okay, and then do you use that data and information then to kind of build on future projects?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And what about advocacy in terms of supporting documentation?
we usually go off of what we use to collect the raw data,
Mm-hmm.
and we use those documents to support whatever it is we are doing.
Okay. Anyone else weigh in on that? Okay, so are there any further questions that you may have?
Just one is, are there like templates or guidelines? I mean, obviously you provide us with the presentation and information, but it's obviously always easier to fill in gaps of something than start from scratch, and that obviously doesn't make sense to start from scratch when there are examples out there. So I was wondering if there was anything that would be shared with us to be able to come up with our data management plans.
Okay, right. The worksheet will have, it is a guideline. So if you follow the guideline, you're actually developing your data management plan. So it has different aspects that with questions guiding you, that you would then respond to those questions, and in so doing, you're developing your data management plan. Okay, so you'll see that once we post it up.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yep. Any further questions?
No, no questions for me.
Okay. Well, this is my first full session with you guys, and I hope you enjoyed it. I know it's a lot of information to expose you to in just 1 hour, but I'm hoping that, as you go through the whole training sessions, then things begin to fall in place, especially when you start to apply it to your own advocacy strategy for your organization.
Yes, great, thank you.
Okay, well, in that case, we can end today's session, and have a good night, everybody.
Thank you, you too.
Good night.
Good night. Good night, everyone.